July 22, 1991, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A young man runs through the street with a single handcuff still hanging from his wrist. He looks terrified. When he sees two police officers, he rushes toward them. Out of breath, he tells them a man tried to harm him. Minutes later, the officers follow him back to an apartment building nearby, Oxford Apartments, Unit 213. Inside the room, something immediately feels wrong. The air smells strange. One officer opens a drawer. Inside are dozens of Polaroid photographs. He studies them for a moment. Then his expression changes. He slowly turns to his partner and says, "I think we need backup." What investigators would soon discover inside that apartment would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. The man who lived there was Jeffrey Dahmer, and by the time police entered that room, 17 people had already lost their lives. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960. He grew up in a quiet suburb in Bath, Ohio. At first glance, the neighborhood seemed ordinary. Tree-lined streets, small family homes, the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Jeffrey's father, Lionel Dahmer, worked as a chemist. His job required long hours and careful scientific work. His mother, Joyce, struggled with serious health problems and often relied on heavy medication. Inside the home, tension was common. Arguments between his parents became part of daily life. For a young child, the environment was unstable. Jeffrey often retreated into himself. Teachers later described him as quiet and polite, but also distant. He rarely spoke in class, and he had difficulty forming close friendships. Many classmates remembered him as the boy who always seemed slightly apart from everyone else. As he grew older, Jeffrey began spending more time alone. He often wandered through the woods near his home, exploring, collecting objects, sometimes bringing home animal bones he found in the forest. His curiosity about anatomy and death slowly developed during these years. It wasn't something most people around him noticed. To the outside world, Jeffrey Dahmer still appeared to be just another teenager growing up in suburban Ohio. But during high school, other changes began to appear. He started drinking alcohol at a very young age, sometimes even bringing alcohol to school. Teachers noticed that his behavior became more unpredictable. At times, he seemed withdrawn and quiet. Other times, he tried strange pranks or odd behavior to make classmates laugh. But behind those moments of awkward humor, Jeffrey Dahmer was becoming increasingly isolated. By the time he graduated from high school in 1978, his family life had fallen apart. His parents were separating, his home was nearly empty, and Jeffrey was about to spend the summer alone. It would be during that summer that everything would take a dark and irreversible turn, because only weeks after graduation, Jeffrey Dahmer would commit his first murder. By the time Jeffrey Dahmer finished high school, his life had become increasingly unstable. His parents' relationship had collapsed. The family home was nearly empty. For weeks, Dahmer was left alone in the quiet house in Bath, Ohio. No routine, no supervision, just long days and even longer nights. It was during this time that something inside him finally crossed the line. One afternoon, while driving through the area, Dahmer noticed a young hitchhiker walking along the road. His name was Stephen Mark Hicks. He was 18 years old. Dahmer offered him a ride. At first, the encounter seemed harmless. The two talked casually as they drove. Eventually, Dahmer invited Hicks back to the house to have a few beers. Hicks agreed. Inside the house, the two young men spent several hours talking and listening to music. But when Hicks eventually said he wanted to leave, Dahmer felt a sudden sense of panic. He didn't want the moment to end. Years later, Dahmer would explain that he felt an overwhelming need to keep Hicks from walking away. In that moment, the situation turned violent. Stephen Hicks was killed inside the house. Afterward, Dahmer attempted to hide what had happened. He buried the remains behind the family home. For years, the crime went completely unnoticed. There was no investigation, no connection back to Dahmer. To the outside world, it seemed like nothing had happened, but the truth was very different. That moment in 1978 had changed everything. Jeffrey Dahmer had crossed a line he could never uncross. And although nearly a decade would pass before he killed again, the thoughts that drove that first crime never disappeared. They remained with him, waiting until the next time he acted on them. And when that moment finally came, the crimes would begin again, this time in a city called Milwaukee. After 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer didn't become a hunted man. He became something far more dangerous, a person who had crossed a line and then returned to everyday life. There was no immediate suspect, no breakthrough, no headline. Stephen Hicks was simply gone, and Jeffrey Dahmer learned a lesson that would shape everything that followed. If he stayed quiet, if he acted normal, if he kept moving, the world would not notice. On the outside, he looked like a young man drifting through early adulthood. On the inside, his life was already collapsing. Alcohol became constant, not social drinking, not weekends, something closer to routine. A way to silence the noise in his head, and a way to keep a fragile sense of control. In 1979, Dahmer joined the United States Army. To his family, it looked like a fresh start. Structure, discipline, distance from the past. He was sent to West Germany, trained as a medic, and placed into an environment where every day was planned for him. For a short time, that structure held, but it didn't change what was inside him, it only covered it. His drinking escalated. Other soldiers later described him as withdrawn and often intoxicated, someone who could shift from quiet to unstable without warning. The military had rules, but Dahmer had a habit that made rules irrelevant. By 1981, the army discharged him, not with a redemption arc, with a record of a young man who couldn't keep himself together. When he returned to the United States, he tried to build a normal life. He went to Florida, he took jobs, he rented rooms, he tried, at least on paper, to become a regular person. But the pattern followed him. Work became inconsistent, his drinking remained heavy, and any sense of stability collapsed again. Eventually, he ended up in Milwaukee, back under a roof, this time with his grandmother. She was strict, religious, and believed that a stable home could straighten him out. For a while, it seemed like it might. Dahmer held small jobs. He kept his head down. He looked from a distance like someone who was finally calming down. But behind that calm was a slow return, a rebuild. The fantasies didn't vanish, they waited. And over time, they came back with more intensity. Milwaukee gave him something he didn't have in Bath, Ohio. Anonymity. A city where you could disappear into the crowd. A place where strangers passed each other every night and never exchanged names. Dahmer began spending more time outside the house. Bars, clubs, late nights where the lighting was low and the conversations were brief. He didn't stand out as threatening. He often appeared awkward, quiet, sometimes even harmless. The kind of person people overlooked. And that was exactly the point. Because while everyone else saw an odd man drinking at the end of the bar, Dahmer was searching, not for love, not for friendship, for opportunity. By the mid-1980s, the distance between thought and action was shrinking. The fantasies were no longer just fantasies. They were becoming plans. And when Jeffrey Dahmer killed again, it wouldn't be an isolated event. It would be the beginning of a pattern that would grow quietly in Milwaukee, until it finally exploded into public view in 1991. By the mid-1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer had learned how to look normal. He lived with his grandmother in Milwaukee. He held jobs that didn't draw attention. He kept his routines simple. To most people, he wasn't threatening. He was just quiet. But underneath that surface, the fantasies had returned with force. And in 1987, Dahmer crossed the line again. One night, he met a young man named Stephen Tuomi. They talked, they drank, and later they left together. Hours passed. Then came the part Dahmer would later describe with chilling detachment. He woke up the next morning in a room he didn't recognize as his, and Tuomi was dead. Dahmer claimed he couldn't remember everything clearly, but the outcome was undeniable. He had killed again. And this time, he didn't run. He didn't confess. He didn't break down. Instead, he began to adapt. He began to build a method. From that point forward, Milwaukee became the perfect environment for what came next. A city where people could be surrounded by strangers. A place where someone could vanish and not immediately make headlines. Dahmer started spending more time in bars and clubs. He approached men who were alone. He was soft-spoken, awkward, non-threatening. He offered money, sometimes for company, sometimes for photographs, sometimes just to bring someone back to his place. To the people he met, it didn't feel like danger. It felt like an uncomfortable but harmless offer. A strange man, a quick deal. Then they would step into his world, behind a door, away from the streetlights, away from witnesses. Over time, Dahmer's routine became more controlled, more deliberate. He learned what to say, how to keep someone relaxed, how to keep the situation moving in the direction he wanted. And the results were devastating. More men disappeared, one after another. Some were teenagers, some were young adults. Many had families who searched. But in a city like Milwaukee, missing persons cases could blur together. And Dahmer relied on that. He relied on time, on silence, on the fact that his victims often lived at the margins, people who could disappear without an immediate national response. As the months turned into years, Dahmer's private life became divided into two worlds. One was what his grandmother saw, a quiet man living at home, a man who went to work and came back. The other world was what Dahmer carried inside him, the obsession, the compulsion, and the need to repeat what he had done. By the end of the 1980s, the pattern was no longer a secret even to Dahmer himself. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a one-time loss of control. It was a cycle. And the only thing he needed to keep it going was a space where no one would look too closely. Soon he would find that space. A small apartment on North 25th Street, a place that looked ordinary from the outside, but would become one of the most infamous addresses in American criminal history, Apartment 213. And once Dahmer moved behind that door, the crimes would escalate rapidly. In 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved into a small apartment building on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. It was the kind of building people rarely remembered. A worn entrance, a narrow hallway, old carpet, faded paint on the walls, neighbors passing each other without names, without conversations, without questions. Dahmer's unit was Apartment 213. From the outside, it looked completely ordinary. Just a door and a long corridor, a brass number plate, a deadbolt. Nothing that suggested anything unusual, but behind the door, Dahmer finally had what he needed most: privacy. No family nearby, no grandmother in the next room, no one asking where he was going at night or why he came home so late. Apartment 213 became the place where his two lives separated, the life people saw and the life he hid. During the day, Dahmer appeared almost invisible, quiet, polite, a man who went to work, returned home, and kept to himself. Neighbors later described him as strange at times, but not threatening. He didn't cause loud arguments. He didn't draw attention. He blended in. But at night, the routine changed. Dahmer would leave the building and go to bars and clubs. He knew where to go. He knew what kind of person to approach. Men who were alone. Men who were looking for a quick conversation, a drink, a distraction. Dahmer wasn't charismatic. He didn't need to be. His approach was often simple: a short conversation, a calm voice, an offer of money. Sometimes he said he wanted to take photographs. Sometimes he offered cash just for company. Sometimes he promised drinks and a place to hang out. To many of the men he met, it sounded strange, but not dangerous. And that was part of what made it so effective, because danger, most of the time, doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, it smiles, it seems harmless, and then the door closes. Apartment 213 was small, not a hidden basement, not a secret building, just a cramped room in a regular city apartment complex. That detail is what makes the case so disturbing, because Dahmer wasn't hiding in the wilderness. He wasn't living off-grid. He was living among people, in a place where neighbors walked past his door every day, where someone could pass him in the hallway, nod politely, and keep walking. Over time, Dahmer's apartment became darker, not in a dramatic way, in a slow, creeping way. The curtains stayed closed, the lights stayed dim. The air inside often carried a strange smell, one he tried to explain away as spoiled food or cleaning chemicals. Some neighbors complained, others ignored it. In apartment buildings, people learn not to ask too many questions. That silence helped him, and inside that silence, Dahmer continued, again and again. As months passed, his obsession deepened. This wasn't only violence, it was control. He wanted to keep people close. He wanted to stop them from leaving. He wanted to freeze a moment in time and own it. And as his thinking grew more extreme, his behavior became more reckless. He documented parts of his life with photographs. He kept objects. He built a private world that no one else could see. Outside, Milwaukee moved on. People went to work. Cars passed through the streets. The city lived normally, But inside apartment 213, the number of missing men quietly grew. Some victims had families searching, others were harder to track. Some lived transient lives. Some didn't have strong support systems. And that reality matters, because it shaped how long Dahmer was able to continue. For years, there were missed chances, moments where he could have been stopped. Small warnings, small signals. A neighbor who complained, a smell that didn't make sense. A quiet man bringing strangers into his apartment late at night. But no one imagined the truth. Not because the signs weren't there, but because the truth was too extreme to consider. By the time Dahmer settled fully into apartment 213, his routine had become almost mechanical. Leave the building, find someone alone, make an offer, return, close the door, and reset. A cycle that turned the apartment into something like a sealed container, separating him from the outside world. And that's why apartment 213 became central to the case. Because it wasn't just where he lived, it was where everything escalated, where the pattern accelerated, and where the entire story would eventually collapse. By the summer of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer believed he was untouchable. He believed he had learned every rule of survival. Stay quiet, stay ordinary, stay invisible. But the longer he continued, the more confident he became. And confidence is often where mistakes begin. Because the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's freedom didn't come from a brilliant detective. It didn't come from a long investigation. It came from a single moment where he lost control. One man who refused to be the next victim. One man who got out of apartment 213 and ran straight into the street. And that moment would trigger everything. The police, the search, the discovery, and the case that would shock the world. On the night of July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer followed the same routine he had repeated many times before. He went to a bar in Milwaukee. There, he met a 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards. The two talked for a short time. Then Dahmer made a familiar offer. He said he would pay Edwards if he came back to his apartment and posed for a few photographs. Edwards agreed. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The two men walked back to the apartment building together. Oxford Apartments, Unit 213. But once inside the apartment, Edwards began to feel uneasy. Something about Dahmer's behavior felt wrong. At one point, Dahmer placed a pair of handcuffs on Edwards, but only on one wrist. The situation became tense. Edwards later said Dahmer's mood shifted suddenly. He became quiet, focused, unpredictable. For nearly an hour, Edwards tried to remain calm. He spoke carefully, looking for an opportunity to escape. Finally, when Dahmer's attention shifted for just a moment, Edwards acted. He struck Dahmer and ran toward the door. Out of the apartment, down the hallway, out of the building, still wearing one of the handcuffs. He ran through the streets until he saw a police patrol. 2 officers. Edwards told them a man had tried to harm him. At first, the officers were unsure what to believe, but when they saw the handcuffs still hanging from Edwards' wrist, they agreed to investigate. The 3 of them returned to the apartment building, back to apartment 213. When Dahmer opened the door, he tried to appear calm. He told the officers everything was a misunderstanding, but when one officer entered the bedroom and opened a drawer, he found something that changed everything. Inside were Polaroid photographs, images that appeared to document violent crimes. The officer looked at the photos, then looked at his partner. Within seconds, the situation escalated. Jeffrey Dahmer was placed under arrest, but the true scale of the crimes was still unknown, because the search of apartment 213 had only just begun. And what investigators were about to discover inside that small Milwaukee apartment would shock the entire world. But the officers inside that apartment still didn't understand what they had truly uncovered. At that moment, they believed they had stopped a dangerous man. What they didn't yet realize was that the small room they were standing in was about to become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. Because hidden inside apartment 213 were secrets that had been building for years, evidence that connected Jeffrey Dahmer to a long list of missing men. Within hours, investigators would begin to understand the scale of what they had discovered, and the story that would soon dominate headlines across the world was only just beginning. Once Jeffrey Dahmer was taken into custody, investigators began a full search of apartment 213. What they found inside quickly confirmed their worst suspicions. The small apartment contained disturbing evidence connected to multiple crimes. Photographs, personal belongings, and items that investigators later linked to several missing men. As the search continued, detectives began piecing together a timeline of events that stretched back years. The investigation soon connected Dahmer to 17 victims. Many of them had disappeared in Milwaukee during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Families who had spent years searching for answers finally began to understand what had happened to their loved ones. The case quickly became international news. Reporters from across the country arrived in Milwaukee. The story of apartment 213 spread rapidly. A quiet apartment building had become the center of one of the most shocking criminal investigations in modern history. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer stood trial. He was convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. The man who had lived quietly among his neighbors was now known around the world. But even after the trial ended, the impact of the case continued. Because the story of Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer just about one man. It was about the lives that had been taken and the questions that remain about how such crimes could go unnoticed for so long. Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. The court ensured that he would never return to society. For many families, the trial brought some form of closure, but the loss could never truly be repaired. In November of 1994, just 2 years after his conviction, Dahmer's life came to an end inside prison. He was attacked by another inmate and later died from his injuries. He was 34 years old. The apartment building where most of the crimes took place was demolished soon after his arrest. Today, the place where apartment 213 once stood is empty. No building, no sign, just an open space in the city of Milwaukee. But the story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not remembered because of the man himself. It is remembered because of the 17 lives that were lost. Lives that should never be forgotten.
If you want more deep dives into the darkest criminal minds in history, make sure to subscribe to the Dark Ledger Archive. Leave a like if you found this case compelling, and tell us in the comments, which case should we investigate next? This is the Dark Ledger Archive.